Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we're going to try to unpack a really, really complex issue, and that's climate change.
Yeah, it's a big one for sure.
And, to make things even more interesting, you've given us a pretty diverse set of sources this time around.
I did.
We've got the latest IPCC reports,
Of course.
which I have to admit, those are pretty dense.
They are. They are thorough.
They are.
Very thorough.
But then we also have this historical analysis of petrodollars.
Yeah.
Which sounds fascinating.
Yeah. Very relevant to the conversation.
And then to top it all off, we even have some notes here that touch on some alternative interpretations of climate change.
Yeah.
Like these era shifts. So
it's a good mix, I think.
Yeah.
To really get us thinking.
It reflects like all these different layers of this challenge.
Okay, absolutely.
And looking at your notes,
Yeah.
your big question seems to be, how much do our individual consumption choices really matter?
Yeah.
When it comes to climate change.
It's the question, isn't it?
Are we talking small ripples here?
Right.
Or are there like these tidal waves beyond our control?
Yeah. Are we a drop in the bucket or are we the bucket?
Yes, exactly.
That's what we need to find out. And to unpack that, we really have to look at the science, the history, and even those perspectives that are, a little bit outside the box.
Yeah. Challenge conventional thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so let's dive in.
Let's do it.
Let's start with those IPCC reports.
Oh, okay.
Because they seem to be like the go-to source.
Yeah, they're the gold standard.
Yeah, for understanding the science of climate change.
If you want the science, that's where you go.
So for someone like me who's, trying to grasp the big picture.
Sure.
What are the key takeaways there?
Well, the reports are really clear.
Mm-hmm.
Human activities, especially those that release greenhouse gases, are the dominant cause of observed warming since the mid-20th century.
Okay, so you're saying it's not just a natural fluctuation.
No.
That we're actually having a measurable impact.
We are the cause.
Wow.
Yeah, and the reports go beyond just, saying that the planet is warming. They actually connect the dots between that warming and changes we're seeing in weather patterns, in sea levels, even the health of ecosystems.
So it's not just about a few degrees hotter.
No.
We're talking like these cascading effects.
Cascading effects, absolutely.
Wow.
And that's where your question about consumption comes in. The report highlights that land use plays a critical role in climate change.
Land use. Okay, so are we talking about things like deforestation?
Deforestation, for sure.
And agriculture.
Agriculture, huge.
Okay.
It's a major factor.
So the way we use land for farming, for raising livestock,
Above it, yeah.
for producing the things we consume.
It has a huge impact.
All of that impacts greenhouse gas emissions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
For instance, deforestation releases carbon dioxide that was stored in those trees. And certain agricultural practices release methane, which is even more potent than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas.
So my burger habit might actually be contributing to climate change.
It's all connected.
That's a sobering thought.
But here's where it gets even more complicated.
Okay.
The IPCC reports also suggest that there are potential benefits to large-scale land-based mitigation efforts.
Mitigation? So you mean ways to like counteract climate change?
Exactly. Things like planting trees, restoring degraded ecosystems, and even changing the way we manage agricultural land.
Okay.
But, and this is a big but,
Okay.
the reports also acknowledge that these large-scale solutions come with their own set of risks.
Like, I mean, I'm all for planting trees, but I can see how it could get a little messy if we're talking about doing it on a massive scale.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Imagine vast plantations of bioenergy crops, plants grown specifically to be burned for fuel.
Okay.
While that might sound like a good way to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, it could also lead to competition for land and resources, potentially affecting food security and biodiversity.
So even when it comes to solutions, there are trade-offs and unintended consequences. Feels like navigating a minefield out there.
It's complex, there's no doubt about it. And that brings us to another layer of complexity, this idea of era shifts that you mentioned. It seems like you're wondering if there are forces at play beyond human control forces that might make our individual actions seem insignificant.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Even if I swap my burger for a veggie patty and bike to work, are those actions enough if we're talking about these larger, almost cosmic shifts?
It's a valid question, and to explore it further, I think we need to shift gears a bit and dive into this historical analysis you've got on the petrodollar era. It might seem like a detour, but I think it will help us understand how we got to where we are today and how deeply entrenched we are in systems that might be contributing to climate change.
Okay, I'm intrigued, petrodollars. It sounds like a currency from a superhero comic.
Well, it's certainly had a powerful impact on global economics and politics. This analysis focuses on the Nixon and Ford administrations in the 1970s, a time when oil-producing nations in the Middle East and North Africa were gaining significant economic power.
So we're going back in time to understand the roots of our current predicament.
Exactly. What's fascinating is that the U.S., under Nixon and Ford, actively encouraged these oil-producing nations to invest their newfound wealth, their petrodollars, back into the American economy.
Why would they do that? Wouldn't that just strengthen those other countries?
It was a strategic move, a way to maintain U.S. influence on a global scale and manage the massive influx of capital from oil sales.
So it was all about maintaining power, even if it meant propping up a system that was heavily reliant on oil.
You could say that. And this historical context is important because it shows how deeply intertwined energy economics and global politics are. And it raises some tough questions about whether simply reducing individual consumption is enough to break free from a system that's been built on and continues to benefit from fossil fuels.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all connects. We've got the science showing the very real impact of human activities on climate change. And now we're seeing how those activities are embedded in these larger systems that have their roots in decisions made decades ago.
Exactly. And before we jump to conclusions about whether individual actions matter or not, I think we need to explore these different pieces of the puzzle a little more deeply.
Well, considering the depth of these sources, I have a feeling we're just getting started. Buckle up, listeners. It's going to be a fascinating ride.
Welcome back to our deep dive on climate change. We covered a lot of ground in the first part, from the science of the IPCC reports to the fascinating history of petrodollars, and even a glimpse into those alternative era shift ideas. So I'm curious, where's your head at right now after processing all of that?
Honestly, I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed. Like we've uncovered this web of interconnected systems and forces, and they're all so much bigger than any one person. It's almost paralyzing.
I get that. It's easy to feel powerless in the face of such a complex challenge.
Yeah, like what's the point of even trying to make a difference?
I hear you. But I think it's important to remember that even amidst these complexities, there are choices we can make both individually and collectively that can shape the future.
Okay, give me some hope here. What can we actually do that'll make a real difference?
Well, the IPCC reports, while definitely highlighting the urgency of the situation, they also offer some potential pathways forward. They've analyzed different scenarios ranging from business as usual to aggressive mitigation efforts, and they've quantified the potential impact of those different choices.
You're saying it's not all doom and gloom. There are actual steps we can take to steer things in a more positive direction.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that even modest mitigation efforts can have a significant impact.
Modest. What does that even mean in the face of this global crisis?
It means things like increasing energy efficiency, shifting to renewable energy sources like solar and wind, and implementing sustainable land management practices. These might seem like small steps, but when multiplied across millions of people and implemented at a systemic level, they can create a ripple effect that shifts the entire system.
So it's not an either-or situation. We need both individual actions and systemic changes to really move the needle.
Precisely. And remember that historical analysis of the petrodollar era. It highlights how deeply entrenched we are in a system that benefits from fossil fuels. But it also shows that systems can change and that financial flows can be redirected.
So instead of petrodollars flowing into industries that contribute to climate change, we could be investing in renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, and research into new technologies that help us mitigate climate change.
Now you're getting it. It's about changing the rules of the game, shifting the incentives, and creating a system that supports rather than hinders a transition to a more sustainable future.
I like that idea. But I'm still wrestling with this question of individual action. Even if we manage to shift those larger systems, does what I do on a daily basis really matter?
That's the question, isn't it? It's true that individual actions alone won't solve climate change, but they're not insignificant either.
Okay, help me understand that. How can my choice to, say, eat less meat or drive less actually make a difference?
Think of it this way. Every time you choose to consume less, you're sending a signal to the market. You're saying, I don't want products that contribute to climate change. And when enough people send that signal, it starts to shift the demand for those products.
So it's about using our consumer power to drive change.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just consumer choices. Every time you talk to your friends and family about climate change, every time you vote for politicians who prioritize climate action, every time you support organizations working on climate solutions, you're contributing to a shift in consciousness, a growing awareness of the issue, and the need for change.
So it's about individual actions adding up to a collective force for change.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that collective force is what can ultimately push those larger systems in a new direction.
Okay, that makes me feel a bit more empowered. But what about those alternative perspectives we talked about? The ones that suggest there are these era shifts happening, things beyond our control. If those are real, doesn't it make all of this effort seem pointless?
Yeah. It's true that there are forces at play that we can't fully control. The Earth's climate has gone through cycles of change throughout history, and there are natural events that can impact the climate, like volcanic eruptions and variations in solar radiation. But that doesn't mean we're powerless.
I'm not sure I follow. How can we possibly influence these larger forces?
It's not about controlling them, but about understanding them and adapting to them. And this is where the IPCC reports are really valuable. They don't just tell us what's happening, they also provide insights into how we can adapt to a changing climate, build resilience, and minimize the negative impacts.
So even if we can't prevent all change, we can still learn to navigate it in a way that minimizes harm and maximizes well-being.
Exactly. Think of it like sailing a ship through a storm. You can't control the wind or the waves, but you can adjust your sails, batten down the hatches, and steer the ship in a way that keeps it afloat.
I like that analogy. It's about being prepared, resourceful, and adaptable. But I still have this nagging question about those era shifts. If those are real, wouldn't it mean that climate change is just part of a natural cycle and that our efforts to mitigate it are ultimately futile?
That's a really interesting question and one that deserves further exploration. While the idea of era shifts falls outside of mainstream scientific understanding, it does challenge us to think about the bigger picture, the cyclical nature of change, and the limits of human control.
So how do we reconcile those seemingly opposing views? On one hand, we have the science telling us that our actions are having a real impact on the climate. On the other hand, we have these alternative perspectives suggesting that larger forces are at play, forces that might dwarf our individual efforts.
It's a tension that many people grapple with. And I think the key lies in finding a balance between accepting what we can't control and taking responsibility for what we can.
It's like that serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference.
Exactly. And when it comes to climate change, wisdom means understanding the science, recognizing the limits of our control, and yet still choosing to act in ways that align with our values and our vision for the future.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But it still feels like a lot to wrap our heads around. We've got individual actions, systemic change, alternative perspectives, and the need for adaptation. How do we bring all of this together into a cohesive strategy for the future?
That's a great question, and one that we'll delve into further in the final part of our deep dive. We'll explore the role of technology, the power of collective action, and the importance of finding meaning and purpose in our efforts to address this complex challenge.
Stay tuned, listeners, because we're about to dive even deeper into the heart of this issue. Welcome back to this deep dive, everyone. It feels like we've been through a lot together, haven't we?
We have.
From the science of those IPCC reports to the history of petrodollars. And then we even explored those mind-bending era shift theories. So now the big question, where do we go from here? What does all of this mean for the future?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think instead of, falling into despair or anxiety, I think going through all of these sources has actually given us a more nuanced picture
Okay.
of the challenge and maybe even some reasons to be hopeful.
Okay. I like the sound of that. I'm definitely ready for some optimism because honestly, it's felt a little bit like we've been just battling a relentless storm out there.
It's a good analogy, though, right?
Yeah.
Even in a storm, skilled sailors can find ways to navigate. And one of the tools we have at our disposal is technology.
Oh, okay. So you're saying technology is like our compass and our map.
It can be.
Yeah.
We've already seen some incredible advancements in renewable energy, electric vehicles, sustainable agriculture.
Yeah.
I mean, the pace of innovation is really remarkable.
It is.
But technology alone isn't a silver bullet.
Right.
It's about how we use it.
Okay.
Right?
Right.
Are we developing and deploying these technologies in a way that's equitable
Right.
and accessible to all? Or are we just creating new gadgets for the privileged few?
That's a really good point.
Mm.
We can't just swap one unsustainable system for another.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, climate justice has to be at the heart of any solution.
Absolutely. And alongside technology, we need something even more powerful.
Which is?
Collective action.
Okay.
No single person, government, or corporation can tackle this alone.
Right.
This requires global effort.
Yeah, it's got to be all of us.
Gotta be all of us.
Okay.
A unified front against climate change.
Easier said than done, though, right? I mean, we're talking about changing the behavior of billions of people. We've got to challenge these deeply entrenched economic systems, and we've got to somehow overcome political gridlock. It feels impossible sometimes, like pushing a boulder uphill.
It's a Herculean task, for sure.
Yeah.
But remember those alternative perspectives we discussed?
The era shifts and all that.
Yeah, the ones about era shifts and forces that are beyond our control.
Right.
They might fall outside of mainstream science,
Yeah.
but they highlight one really important truth. Change is inevitable.
Okay, but how does that help us? If change is inevitable, are we just along for the ride?
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
Knowing that change is inevitable can actually be empowering.
Okay.
It frees us from this illusion of control,
Right.
and it allows us to focus on what we can influence our responses, our choices, and our collective actions.
Okay.
And I think those era shift ideas, even if we don't fully subscribe to them,
Mm-hmm.
they remind us that humanity has weathered storms before.
Yeah.
We've adapted to changing circumstances, and we've found ways to thrive.
So it's about harnessing that resilience,
Yes.
that ability to adapt and evolve.
Exactly. And that's where the power of collective action comes in.
Okay.
Think about those movements you mentioned earlier. The youth climate, strikes, the divestment campaigns, even those conversations that are happening in communities around the world. These are all part of a growing wave of awareness,
Right.
a shift in consciousness that's pushing for change.
I mean, I'm feeling a surge of hope just thinking about it.
Good.
But I have to admit, there are days when it feels like just a drop in the ocean. What do you say to someone who's feeling that way, feeling overwhelmed, like their actions just don't really matter?
I would say this: every action, no matter how small, has the potential to ripple outwards
Okay.
and create change. That choice to bike instead of drive, that decision to eat less meat, that conversation you have with a friend about climate change.
Hmm.
These seemingly small acts, when they're multiplied across millions of people, become a powerful force.
It's about finding that meaning and purpose in those everyday choices,
Yeah,
knowing that we're all a part of something bigger than ourselves.
absolutely. And it's also about finding joy in those choices.
Oh, wow.
The joy of connecting with nature, of building community, of creating a world that's more just and sustainable for all.
You know what? This entire deep dive has really been a journey. It's been a roller coaster of emotions. And I think ultimately it's a reminder that even facing a challenge as complex and as daunting as climate change is, we still have the power to choose hope, to choose action, and to choose a future where humanity and this planet we call home can thrive together.
Well said. I couldn't agree more.
Well, thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
It really has. It's been a privilege to explore these ideas with you. And to our listener out there, we hope this conversation has sparked your curiosity, fueled your hope, and inspired you to keep exploring, keep questioning, keep taking action. Because ultimately, the future is ours to create the